In 2005, director George Clooney and star David Strathairn gave the world a quietly powerful look into an unexpectedly modern predicament.
In 2021, we get back on the Glenmoe train as we take our third consecutive trip to the Scottish Highlands.
The film is Good Night and Good Luck.
The whiskey is Glenmorangie 18.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
This week we're looking at the 2005 Best Picture nominee Good Night and Good Luck.
Mr. Edward R. Murrow has made repeated attacks upon me and those fighting communists.
Somebody's going to go down.
You're going to get audited this year.
Not me, you.
McCarthy wants April 6th.
I will not be deterred.
He's going to come after me.
You understand the position you're putting us in?
Let's walk very carefully through these next few moments.
Why don't you just fire me, Bill?
Go after Joe Kennedy. We'll pay for it.
Murrow is the symbol, the leader, and the cleverest of the jackal pack, engaged in propaganda for communist causes.
Okay, fellas, here we go.
We might as well go down swinging.
We're going to go with the story, because the terror is right here in this room.
Brad, this movie comes from my list of films for season 5, and I am freaking pumped to talk about this movie because, you know, it's a really small movie. It was made on a shoestring budget. It got awards buzz back in the day, but I feel like no one really talks about this movie anymore unless they're like a high school student who had to watch it for some sort of a school newspaper class or something. It seems like it's really fallen out of, I don't know, the zeitgeist. And I'm just really excited to talk to you about it because I know it was your first time seeing it.
Yeah, honestly, based on what I knew about the movie was the title and the poster, the box cover for the movie. It almost makes it feel like a film noir. Like in my mind, it was like maybe a spy thriller or some sort of like detective type movie, which I guess in a certain sense, it has a bit of a detective aura about it. But in my mind, it was going to be a film noir throwback that Clooney did in the 2000s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really anything but. I mean, this is George Clooney kind of throwing back to all those journalist movies that he loved when he was growing up. You know, when he was watching All the President's Men in the 1970s. And, you know, his favorite movie, he's gone on record many times talking about how his favorite movie was Network. And, you know, in the early 2000s, he actually had a deal struck with CBS that he was going to direct a live on-air version of Network. And that was going to be like his big thing. You know, back before NBC was doing all these like live musicals they're doing now, Clooney wanted to do this. Like he wanted to do it in the style they would have done it 40, 50 years prior to that. And he just never got around to it. And in a lot of ways, this movie becomes his Network. It's about a real life story, but it's about, you know, the inner workings of a newsroom and the tolls that takes on people's personal lives. And Brad, I'm so excited to talk about this movie, man.
Yeah, I also realized that we should have done the entire intro as if we were Edward R. Murrow.
I think we should have done like old-timey newsreels.
Newsflash, you see? Good Night and Good Luck strikes it rich. Powerful movie.
So yeah, okay, I'm going to just come out and say it like this. I love this movie a lot, and watching it this time, my feelings were confirmed. I told you to watch the movie with subtitles on because I think what Clooney and his co-writer Grant Heslov did so well with this script was they just lifted so much material directly from Edward R. Murrow's telecasts. And it's just kind of cut and pasted in here. And he is such a great orator. Like his speech writing is just so good. But if you're not kind of reading along with it, I think a little bit of the power of those words gets lost a little bit. And I'm listening to those powerful words being spoken, but I also think that what Clooney and Heslov did so well is in the scenes where they're not just replicating somebody's speeches, they really write in an old school manner where everyone's really quick-witted. There's a lot of zingers. And Brad, I'm just going to spoil myself here. I'm going to give this movie a 10 out of 10. And I realized that I don't think this is a perfect movie. Like if someone said, what's the definition of a perfect film? I don't think I would pick this as a perfect movie, but it is a movie where I think every decision that was made was the right decision. I don't know if that makes sense, but like if I had to distinguish between the two, like I think every little directorial decision that Clooney makes, every acting decision, and then a lot of the screenwriting stuff, it seems like at every point they made the correct decision to make this movie just work.
If you were talking to me about the message of this movie and the way that message was executed, I'm with you that aspect of the movie is a 10 out of 10. For me, though, I don't know what my final score is going to be, but it's not going to be a 10 out of 10. I think that there are issues with this movie that I'm excited to talk about, but I'm with you in that I think this is a very important movie, and I'm not gonna nitpick a ton here. It's a phenomenal movie. It's extraordinarily well made. I've never experienced Clooney as a director before, so this was a really impressive, for me, first glimpse of him as a director. I do think that there are some issues throughout, though, that keep me from giving it a 10 out of 10.
Well, then let's dive in, Brad. I know you hadn't seen it before now, so let's move into Brad Explains, the part of the podcast where Brad breaks down the film he's just seen often for the first time. Brad, can you give our listeners a 60-second overview of Good Night and Good Luck?
I think I could probably just send them to Wikipedia. Like, just Google Joseph, is it R? Joseph R. McCarthy?
Yep.
Just go Google him. You'll figure it out. But in all reality, this movie is about how Joseph McCarthy is a big old dick, and Edward Murrow calls him out on it on national TV multiple times. He gets threatened by the studio executive, the owner of CBS, but in the end, they back him because I think they realize what he is doing is right and morally good, and that what McCarthy is doing is morally reprehensible. So that's what it's about, Bob.
Boom. Yeah, so there's a lot of historical context with this movie, and I don't know necessarily that you have to know a lot going in. Brad, I'm sure you were familiar in some capacity with Joe McCarthy and the communist, witch hunt and the HUAC hearings.
I've never,
in the 50s.
Ever once heard of the Red Scare.
never, ever.
Not a single time.
But I feel like, 60, 70 years on now, we might not be as familiar with somebody like Edward R. Murrow, but he was the most famous newsman in America at the dawn of television.
Yeah, he's the one who said that you should be pissed and that they just don't, open up your windows and you don't give a damn anymore.
I'm as mad as hell.
I'm as mad as hell.
There it is.
That's Edward Murrow,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Okay.
So I think that knowing a little bit of the historical context does help, but I think also just kind of being plopped right into the middle of it was really beneficial for this movie. This movie clocks in at an hour and 32 minutes, including the end credits. And, it doesn't necessarily move at a lightning pace. Like, I think Clooney really draws some scenes out. He uses silence really well. But I am really glad this movie isn't 2 hours and 15 minutes long. And it didn't give us, Edward R. Murrow grew up on a farm in Nebraska. And you get the scene of his brother sawing himself in half, like in Walk the Line. I don't need any of that. You know what I mean? Like, just give me Murrow at the height of his powers, deciding to take on McCarthy. I really love that this is like pared down to the essentials.
When you said his brother sawing himself in half, I was like, whoa, man, where are we going with this?
I just feel like every biopic has to have that flashback to like
something tragic.
When they grew up in the Midwest and they had the abusive alcoholic father. Like, I'm so glad we didn't go there with this.
Yeah, man. I think the movie just jumps in right at the right point. And I think that if you're going to be the slowest paced movie I've ever seen in my life, you'd better only have like an actual screen time of an hour and 20 minutes. Like the credits were like 6 or 7 minutes long. So I'm pretty sure the runtime's like an hour 24, hour 25. And like you said, it's a slow paced movie, which really fits the era that they were trying to represent. I actually went back and watched one of the original broadcasts from Murrow, and it fits. Like, that is how the news was presented back in the day. And so I think that Clooney really, it's not just stylistic. I think it's an honest representation of what our country used to look like and how we used to experience news. And so if nothing else, I think it's an important artifact to help us understand what it was like for the average American to tune in to the nightly news, because nowadays we have no idea what it looks like to have somebody stoic and honest presenting the news, regardless of what outlet you tune into.
So this was a thing that Clooney really wanted to shoot for. Like, this was his aim. His dad, George Clooney's dad, was a newsman in Cincinnati where he grew up. And so this was like kind of in his blood. And, you know, I read a little piece of trivia online that he was really nervous to show the movie to his dad. And when the movie was over, his dad just kind of got up and patted him on the shoulder and told George Clooney, yeah, you got it right. That's exactly what it was like.
I feel like there's going to be a biopic of Clooney, and it's going to culminate in that moment.
Right. And it's going to start with Clooney growing up on a farm and his brother sawing himself in half.
And his overly alcoholic father.
Well, one thing I love about the way this movie is set up, Brad, and I want to go back to your point about it being really slow paced, because I think this movie is either going to really feel like a suspenseful, tense movie, or it's going to feel like a really slow movie. Clooney uses silence, I think, so well in this movie, where when you start to understand the gravity of what Murrow and his producer, Fred Friendly, are doing by using the biggest platform in America and risking all their sponsors and risking their careers and knowing that McCarthy's going to come after them to take him down. And then you have, you know, this calm, stoic guy in Murrow just sitting there as George Clooney's character tells him, like, yeah, we've got 20 seconds to air. And you see him getting fidgety and you see him tapping his foot. It really starts to drive home this point of like, oh, even this guy is nervous and shaken by what he knows is coming down the road. And I think that this is one of those movies that really is more rewarding on repeat viewings. You catch more of the really profound things that are said, but you also, I think, are able to kind of like enter into the groove of, you know, the first time you're just trying to figure out what the storyline is, whereas like second, third, fourth time you watch this movie, you're just kind of plopped right in the middle of it. I think you can feel the characters' feelings a little bit better on rewatch.
Yeah, I'm with you on everything that goes on with Murrow in this movie. I think that the way you watch him interact with his coworkers, like, you feel the weight that he is carrying. He has the sense of a leader for the fact that you can tell that he is shouldering the majority of the burden of this truth-telling saga that he's embarking on, where all the people around him are celebrating and cheering when, you know, this Air Force lieutenant gets reinstated and when McCarthy is being censured and all these things happen. Whereas for Murrow, the victory isn't the thrill of victory isn't necessarily what he's looking for. For him, it is a genuine hero's journey of, I am here to bring the truth, regardless of the outcome. And there's almost like this admiration that you find yourself giving to Murrow because of his lack of emotion in the personal spaces that he also shares when he is publicly broadcasting.
Well, and I think that one thing that you may not catch on the first viewing that really didn't hit home for me until this time around was how much this movie is about the price of doing the right thing. Like, they don't quite go into what happens to Murrow's career after this movie, but the movie is bookended with this speech that Murrow is giving, where he's being given essentially a Lifetime Achievement Award. And in real life, that award was given to him 3 months after he was essentially fired from CBS. Like, the owner, the founder of CBS, Paley, kept giving him less and less airtime because he was getting more and more controversial. And basically, this most famous newsman in America now was out of a job. And 3 months later, they give him a Lifetime Achievement Award, which seems like they're really just rubbing it in at that point. And he just decides to use that speech to rail against the state of television in America and how we are going down this path where we're not using television to inform. We're not treating our viewers with dignity and respect. We're using them as marketing tools and manipulating them. And it's so kind of prophetic and prescient.
Also, I thought it was just fascinating that they throw that little shtick in there where they're like, by the way, we're going to increase your time to 60 minutes and put you on Sunday afternoon. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's where 60 Minutes came from. Never knew that.
That's really funny, though. I mean, but that is like the deadest time of the week for people to watch TV.
100%. Yeah. Nobody's watching on Sunday afternoon. They're watching football or mowing their yard or having a family barbecue.
And again, that gets me back to this whole idea of like, Clooney really is underscoring the price of what Murrow's doing. Like, you talked about how Murrow was committed to the truth, but it basically lost him his job. And at every turn in the movie where they win a small victory, it seems like they go 2 steps back. You know what I mean? Like, it starts with them doing a profile on this guy who was kicked out of the Air Force for being accused of being a communist when no one had even seen the charges against him because they were in a sealed envelope. And at the end of the movie, you find out that guy's been reinstated and everyone's like, hooray. But then they find out that, one of their fellow newsmen who is being like harassed by the McCarthy apparatus killed himself. And you're like, oh, like 2 steps back there. Murrow is being given a Lifetime Achievement Award and you think everything's going well, but he's actually out of a job. And when it seems like they've finally taken down McCarthy because he's going to be censured, they basically had this conversation of like, yeah, but he's not going to get kicked out of the Senate. They'll just move him to the back row. And there is this kind of question of like, all right, was this worth it, what we did? Because it seemed to come at a great personal cost to us. And I think there are very few movies, Brad, that do such a good job of balancing this like portrait of an American hero, quote unquote, with also what happens to people who do heroic things in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, the cost of winning against McCarthy was almost like the soul of news, like televised news, right? Because in the end, this is one of the last time that news really was able to tell the truth in an unbiased manner. That like, as you lost people like Edward Murrow, the television industry just pushed stronger and stronger towards what we see in network, which is the selling of the news syndicate to entertainment. Mm-hmm. That in order to keep your news programs, you have to draw viewers. And in order to draw viewers, you have to talk about crazier things. You have to do bigger stunts. You have to sensationalize the news. And so I really think that that's the big dilemma of this movie is we won the battle against McCarthy, but we lost, like you said, we lost the war for the soul of unbiased, honest news journalism.
Yeah. Well, I think another area where this movie really succeeds, if you know anything about George Clooney, you know that he is a very liberal person in Hollywood. And we don't talk about politics that much on the show, but I fall more on the left. Brad falls more on the right, relatively speaking. And I think that there's a way to watch this movie, like if you just don't like George Clooney and you don't like what he stands for politically, that you just, you watch this movie and you're like, oh, this is like a liberal movie. But I actually think that this movie and the script do such a good job of presenting all of the sides of the argument here. Like even the character played by Jeff Daniels, who's kind of like a, like a senior VP or something at the company. He's always representing the interests of the company and the sponsors. But you understand even his point of view because he comes down and he talks to Murrow and Fred Friendly about what they're doing and basically says, hey, our policy forever has been that we don't editorialize. We offer both points of view and we let people pick it out for themselves. Aren't you editorializing by doing this? And it really does kind of ask the question, like, yes, I think they did the right thing by putting McCarthy, on blast here, but also, is this the beginning of, the trail that we've gone down with TV news now, where everything is super partisan, right? Like at the end of the movie, Paley is even talking to them and Murrow's saying, why are you trying to censor us? And he's like, why didn't you correct this person who's known for being a communist? Is it because you knew that it was a bad look for you to look like you were defending a communist? Like you censor, everyone censors. And I think it, like, adding that kind of gray area to a story that seems like a very black and white, good guys and bad guys, really helps this movie overall.
Well, and the beauty of this movie is that I think it's so weirdly important in 2021, almost 2022, because what Clooney was pointing out in 2005 was something that Murrow was pointing out in the 50s, which was you can't just accuse people of something without evidence. Mm-hmm. You can't just manufacture claims and use that in a bully pulpit to get your viewpoints across. And it isn't just the left, it's the right as well. We see people getting more and more extreme ideologically on both sides. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it's just sad. Honestly, Bob, this movie just made me sad because I'm like, if Murrow was picking up on this in the freaking 1950s, he has to be turning over in his grave to see what is happening in the news media, to see what is happening with the average citizen, to see what is happening on the far fringes of the political left and right. Like, it's just got to be it would be brutal for him if he came back and saw what was happening.
Well, and the thing that I wrote down was just how sad it is that the sensationalism of McCarthy has just become the norm now, like with all of our politicians.
Dude,
you think about how well spoken everyone is in this movie, and then you have McCarthy get up and he's just like accusing people blindly of things that are just blatantly untrue, but knowing that he can use this like apparatus of the media to just convince people without facts. And I'm like, oh, this is every politician now. And they use the lowest common denominator to speak to each other. And it's just so weird to think about how, like, in the 50s, like, obviously what McCarthy was doing was dangerous, and he was an outlier because of that, but he was also an outlier because of the approach that he took. And I think that approach is basically like the majority approach nowadays.
Well, and it feels like both sides of the aisle use the have you no human decency card against each other. Like my side of the aisle is the only side that can have human decency. And anything you say on the other side means that you don't actually have respect for other human beings. You don't actually care about the problems at hand. You just care about your ideology. When in reality, both sides are doing the exact same thing. In order to be a better Republican or a better Democrat, you have to one up the Democrat who's a little closer to the center than you, or the Republican who's a little closer to the center than you. Like you're trying to prove your membership in the party or something. Yeah. And I think there's just a huge swath of people left behind by this wild sensationalism. And my final thought is, we have gotten vastly political in this episode.
I was just going to say, man, when you right before you started talking, I was like, all right, I'm going to bring us back. And then we went even further down that rabbit hole. So let's talk about the movie, because I think it's a good sign that the movie has sparked these things in our conversation, because we very purposely don't go into these things on our podcast. So I think it says volumes about what the movie is making rise up within us that we're talking about it. But I do want to talk, let's talk performances, because I think pretty universally everybody in this movie is good. And everybody's well cast. I think one of the things that I really, really like about it is Clooney uses an old newsreel, almost documentary style. Like, if you've ever seen an old documentary, they were filmed very differently than they are today. And I guess one of the things that Clooney did was each morning they would kind of have a newsroom meeting, and they would look through the newspaper for that day, and Clooney would assign each person that worked in this newsroom, read an article, and then basically go type out the article in their own words. And then they would all reconvene, an hour later or whatever, and they would be pitching their ideas like they were pitching them to go on the air at CBS. And he just had hidden cameras all around the room during those pitch meetings. And that's why so many of these scenes feel so realistic, and there's overlapping dialogue, and, it seems real loose. And I think it works so well at capturing the vibe of that place. But then even in the more scripted scenes, I never felt like anybody was being overly dramatic. Even when we're on air with Edward R. Murrow, everything really seemed to be of a piece. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, this might sound weird to talk about a real world movie, or I should say a movie about the real world, but Clooney's world building in this is fantastic. Mm-hmm. Because if we're being honest, there are very few people in 2005 when this movie came out, or in 2021, who genuinely remember the 1950s. Like, if we're just being honest, like, my dad is in his mid-60s. He was born in 1958. He doesn't remember the news until probably the late 60s, early 70s. Yeah. So for Clooney to take the time to do really healthy, really invigorating world building and set you up for what it looked like to be a television news person in the 1950s, it's really helpful for you to get your bearings, to understand why it's important, what Murrow and Friendly are doing, and why it's important that they do it in the right way. It's really just well done. And I think that any director looking to write or direct a period piece could look to this movie for a lot of tips.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it reminds me of what we just talked about a few weeks ago with Pride and Prejudice. I feel like so often period pieces take the low road of kind of like the Green Book approach, if I'm being honest, of like, hey, here's an old car. Remember old cars? And hey, here's somebody drinking out of a glass Coca-Cola bottle. And they shoehorn in these cultural references in a way that's like trying to beat you over the head of like, it's the 1960s. And I think that's kind of the problem with a lot of these 80s throwback movies we're getting now, like the new Ghostbusters, and like so many of these movies just rely on nostalgia in a way that's not really earned. And you never really feel like you're actually living in that era. Whereas a movie like this, they just found a way to kind of replicate what I imagine the vibe of a 1950s newsroom would be. And so you never really question what era you're in. It's not necessarily about the details. The details are certainly there. It's more of making it feel like a real lived-in world.
And in order to really make it feel real and lived in, you have to have characters who feel authentic to the era. And I really feel like 90% of the acting in this movie was just spot on. The casting was great. But for you, Bob, who really stood out to you in this cast? Who really captivated you with their performance?
I mean, I genuinely think that David Strathairn just knocks it out of the park. This movie it rests on his shoulders and he kills it. Like, he's known for being a character actor. He's always a supporting actor. He's in a movie that's coming out this week that's getting awards buzz, Nightmare Alley. He's a great character actor. And when you give a movie like this to a person who's used to playing small roles like that, they usually do such a great job. He doesn't have like the aura of a movie star, but he does such a good job starring in this movie. And I would say, like, even though he's the biggest character in the movie, he is the standout for me, acting wise.
I'm with you, dude. I thought that Strathairn portrayed the proper sense of gravitas that I think Murrow conveyed in his nightly broadcasts.
We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. We must remember always that accusation is not proof, and that conviction depends upon evidence and due process of law. We will not walk in fear one of another. We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason if we dig deep in our history and our doctrine. And remember that we are not descended from fearful men, not from men who feared to write, to associate, to speak, and to defend the causes that were for the moment unpopular. This is no time for men who oppose Senator McCarthy's methods to keep silent, or for those who approve. We can deny our heritage and our history, but we cannot escape responsibility for the results. We proclaim ourselves, indeed, as we are, the defenders of freedom wherever it continues to exist in the world. But we cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home.
And even just watching a few of the original footage of Murrow, you can tell that Strathairn spent some serious time with who Murrow was, what he was all about, the inflections of his voice. And I think that this is an example of when you have a character that doesn't necessarily look like the original person, like Strathairn doesn't really look like Murrow at all. but he embodies the heart and soul of what Murrow was all about. And to me, that's what you're looking for when you do a biopic. Mm-hmm. You know, I hate to beat a dead horse, but Bohemian Rhapsody, sure, they made him look like Freddie Mercury. Great. But that's not what made Freddie Mercury Freddie Mercury. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think that what you see here with Strathairn is just out of this world comparably. Outside of Strathairn, though, it was fun to see Robert Downey Jr. not be Iron Man.
Right? This was Robert Downey Jr. like just coming out of being like a drug addict, like, and trying to reestablish his career. And here he is showing up in this little movie, and he does such a good job when he's not having to be Tony Stark. And that's not to say he's not great as Tony Stark. He is. But, you know, like when you see Johnny Depp in his like 5th Pirates of the Caribbean movie, everyone there, including Johnny Depp, is like, this is getting old at this point. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And I think just seeing Robert Downey Jr. just be like a guy was so refreshing for me.
And then, honestly, Bob, this is just a nerd shout out. Ray Wise as Hollenbeck.
So good.
If there's any fellow nerds out there who played Red Alert 2 way back in the day, the cool thing about this video game series is that it was the first one to use like live action movie footage in the cutscenes. And Ray Wise was the freaking president of the United States of America. And every time I see him in a movie or a TV show or anything, I don't know what it is. The small child in me goes like, oh yeah, that was one of the best games I ever played. And I got so pumped when I saw him in this movie.
He's been in everything. Like he's all over the place. And, you know, I think some of our listeners will know him from being Robin Scherbatsky's dad in How I Met Your Mother.
Yep.
So like, and he's great. I think everyone's great. I could talk about every single performance, but I think they're all really good. It sounds like, Brad, there might be like one that you weren't down with.
The one person that I just never understood why he was there. So this might be a script problem. So Jeff Daniels in this movie, why is he there? Because, like, I agree with you, that one scene where he's trying to explain, you know, the other point of view, he does a fine job with it. But, like, Paley makes sense to me. He almost feels a little bit, like, Paley almost feels like Ned Beatty from Network.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, like, he makes sense to me, but Jeff Daniels just has this weird, like, intermediary role. He's only in the, like, maybe 2 or 3 scenes in the movie, really. Mm-hmm. And he just felt kind of lackluster to me, and almost like the Matt Damon syndrome of like, oh, wait, why is Jeff Daniels in this movie? Like, he's a big name actor, but he barely does anything in this film. Not sure about his purpose in the script. He didn't work for me.
I understand that. I mean, I do think if you're going to use like the Network comparison, then I think that Jeff Daniels is like the Robert Duvall of that movie. Do you know what I mean? Like he is the middleman, and you don't really get to see the big boss until shit has really hit the fan. So you're right, though. Like if they really wanted to, they could have condensed that down and just made it only be Paley who was ever coming down to talk to them. But I liked that you had the sense of, as they continue to ruffle feathers and rile people up, like, oh, this guy from upstairs is now coming down to talk to us. And then it's like, hey, Paley wants to talk to you. And it's like, oh, like that's a step up from Jeff Daniels, you know? So
they should have had the dun, dun, dun.
Well, hey, man, I think we are in a really good place on this. Let's hit pause. Let's try this Glenmorangie 18. What do you say?
Let's get to it.
All right, so today we are drinking the third of our 3 Glenmorangie products. We'd initially, Brad, talked about having 5 Glenmorangie products on the show, but we've been working with their national brand ambassador, and it turns out that in a control state like Ohio, it's really hard to get shipments of whiskey. So we had to quickly amend our plan. So we're having 3 instead of 5, but the first 2 have been pretty darn good, as Glenmorangie tends to be.
Yeah, dude, Glenmorangie, from the very start, we started off knowing almost nothing about Scotch, and we got a Glenmorangie sampler pack. A few of them were like fine, above average whiskeys, and a few of them blew our freaking socks off. And so ever since, we have been on a crusade just trying to promote the heck out of Glenmorangie. And so here we are a few years later, slightly more refined palates, just maybe.
Slightly.
And I am so excited to drink this 18-year. Bob, I feel like a lot of scotches, it feels like 18-year is like their flagship year.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's the point where, like, you get Johnny Walker Blue Label. It's an 18-year scotch, and it costs over $200, I believe.
Yeah.
It just feels like a lot of scotches, once you start talking about 18-year, I remember drinking an Oban 18-year with a buddy of mine and him telling me, like, yeah, man, this is when scotch really starts to get real. And so for me, I'm really pumped to get into this one. I think Glenmorangie knocks almost everything out of the park. So here we are. Bob, what are you picking up on the nose of this Glenmorangie 18?
Well, before we get into the nose, I want to say just real quick. So the one we're drinking today, it's the Glenmorangie 18-year, extremely rare. That's the thing I love most about it. Extremely rare. And the bottle itself it's a different type of bottle than what we see with the other Glenmorangies. Like, it has a much heavier base. You can tell it's just like it's a higher quality product even than what we're used to with Glenmorangie. And the particular one that we were sent is this special limited edition that came in this incredible box with artwork designed by Azuma Makoto. And it has this just insanely beautiful floral bouquet pattern on it. Brad, next time I see you in person, I'm going to have to show you this box because, like, you know, Brad and I live 2 hours apart. I had to give you a sample in, like, some Joe Schmo bottle. The actual bottle of this, if we had a category on just packaging, this is like an 11 out of 10. So you can already tell the thought and the care that's being put into this product. Brad, I'm going to take my first nosing of it because I have not tried it yet. So I'd actually prefer, if you don't mind, if you could share your nosing notes with the audience.
Yeah, as I got into this, it's a softly complex nose. There's honey, there's bits of candied fruit. For me, a little bit of nuttiness, almost like a hazelnut kind of feel to it. There's dates, there's raisins, and a little hint of floralness that kind of just hits you on the cusp of your nosing. I really like this nose a lot. I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10.
This is one of the very first scotches that I can say that one of the predominant notes is butterscotch. Like, I got, your typical, you work through that kind of nice soft barley that you get with these Highland scotches. And right underneath that was like a blast of, it was like ice cream topping, and it was butterscotch. And I was like, finally, we have finally found it on a scotch.
We found it.
And then I get quite a bit of what you're talking about. There's a lot of floralness here. There's some nice honey. There's a little bit of fruit. This one had an almost kind of like I just pictured like waving fields of grain when I was nosing. It's not that, I don't want to say that it's like grain forward because that makes it sound like it's a young product, and this is clearly not. But this definitely had like an earthier kind of almost wheat-like scent to me. And I'm really digging it. I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 just because I'm not sure where it's going yet. But it's an intriguing nose, to be sure.
Yeah, and then we jump into the taste. Bob, this is the epitome of scotch for me. I mean, it's got honey. For me, it's almost like a sweet date kind of feel. There's a little bit of nuttiness, and it's mixed in with just a little teeny tiny hint of smoke. The barley flavor is just perfectly balanced with everything else that is going on here. It's creamy and delicious. I love this. I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10.
Wow. Yeah, see, I like this a lot. I don't know if I'm quite as high as you on this one. I'm going to say something that's going to sound probably more negative than it is. But the way that like LaCroix has like the essence of whatever, like strawberry, but it doesn't actually have like the sweetness of a strawberry. You know what I mean? This hit my palate in the same way that like eating a spoonful of butterscotch topping would, but it doesn't have the sweetness of butterscotch. It's really weird. I was like, oh, butterscotch right there. I mean, immediately my tongue picked up on it, and I was waiting for that wave of like really rich, sugary, like almost too much sugariness to hit me. And it never came. Like, it stayed in a very kind of like dark coffee bean kind of like wheelhouse for me. I guess I would compare it almost to like drinking a flavored coffee bean, but drinking the coffee black. Does that make sense? Like a butterscotch flavored coffee for me. This is go ahead.
The coffee shop that I used to work at had a flavored bean that was called Scottish grog.
Mm-hmm.
And this reminds me of that. I'm with you, dude. There's a little bit of bitterness, black coffee going on that for me really enhances the flavor.
I'm going to give this a 9 out of 10. I like this a lot. And one thing that I've noted here is that this is only 86 proof, which I believe is the lowest proof of the 3 that we've had. I have to go back and check. But what the 18 years in the barrel is doing with this is it's making it so much more spicy. Like there was just such a nice tingle on my tongue from this. And it's something that I wouldn't expect from an 86 proof whiskey. And so instead of being like over oaked and tasting bitter, no, I really do think it's just bringing out like some of these nice kind of peppery qualities in the whiskey. And I guess that kind of segues me into the finish. It finishes warm. Like there's a nice kind of what we would call a Kentucky hug on the way down. It's not overly bitter. It's mouth watering. I think this has the finish that the Cadball Estate was lacking for me. Like if the Cadball had this kind of finish, I think it would have gotten a significantly higher score from me. Brad, this is just all around a very pleasant, enjoyable drinking experience. I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10.
Yeah, I'm at a 9 out of 10 on the finish. For me, it's incredibly creamy and smooth, and yet it just hits on all cylinders with a little bit of a smoky, kind of oaky finish. I'm just blown away by what they're doing here with their 18-year offering, and the balance is a 10 out of 10 for me. You hit every single category of what you are looking for a non-peated Scotch in this whiskey. And so I can't imagine a better balanced Scotch.
Yeah, I think I have to keep divorcing in my head like this kind of a product from one of their finished products, because we love the Quinta Reuben. But part of what gives the Quinta Reuben that really nice sweetness is the fact that it's finished in port barrels, right? Like this is not finished in port barrels. This is just your kind of standard baseline single malt Scotch, and it's just aged for longer. And so, if I kind of put finished Scotches in a different category from whatever you want to call it, regular Scotches, what I'm thinking about is how does this compare to those? I think you're right, Brad. This is, I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 on the balance. And I think it's just because at the end of the day, I do prefer to have a little bit of sweetness with my whiskey. But for a category like this, I'm hard pressed to think of a better balanced Scotch than this one. So it's going to be a 9 out of 10 for me.
And that brings us into our value category. Now, Bob, in the state of Ohio, it is currently on sale for $99, but I'm going to go with its regular price of $110. In looking at this whiskey at $110, I just feel like the world of Scotch is so much different than bourbon.
Yeah.
Right? And when you look at other 18-year offerings or even older offerings, when you look at a Johnnie Walker Blue Label, I just think that when you're looking at these other whiskeys that are similarly aged that cost $50, $80, $100 more, I think that this is a really solid value, especially when you consider the fact that this is daggone delicious whiskey, Bob.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, this is hard for me to do with a whiskey that costs in the triple digits, but I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10 on value.
I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 on value. The Cadball Estate was $90. This is $20 more, and I think this is worlds better. And that's not to knock the Cadball Estate. I liked that whiskey. Of all the Glenmorangies we've had, that's probably the one that gets me the least excited. This one is all right, you get this incredible packaging with it. It's the highest age statement we've had from a Glenmorangie on the show so far. And you're only shelling out, $20 more. I think $110 is more than reasonable for what you're getting here. So it's an 8 out of 10 for me, which is bringing me to a pretty high 42.5 out of 50. Brad, what are you coming out to?
I'm a little bit higher than you, Bob. I have reached close to the pinnacle of the whiskey world that we've created for ourselves. I'm at a 46.5.
Wow. All All right, so that's bringing us to a 44.5 on average, or an 89 out of 100. Typically, if something hits the 40 out of 50 mark, it's a no-brainer, pick it up and enjoy. If it hits 45 or a 90 out of 100, it's, at the highest peak we've ever had. So this is like right there. Really,
it's right on the edge.
Yeah, really good stuff. I still don't know if I would put it above Quinta Rubin, just because we can get 2+ bottles of the Quinta Rubin for this,
Yeah.
But
yeah, no,
but still,
you're totally right, man.
But for what you're getting, I mean, this is damn good stuff.
Well, Bob, I think that we have waxed poetically long enough. We will have plenty more opportunities in the future to rhapsodize over Glenmorangie. For now, I think it's time we get back to our film of the day. Good night and good luck.
Let's get to it, Brad. All right, that was Glenmorangie 18. We are getting back into talking about good night and good luck. Brad, I want to go back to something you were saying in the first half, which is that this movie does feel kind of shaggy, even at an hour and a half. I understand where you're coming from. I disagree with you because I think we might be kind of coming down in different places on ultimately what we think this movie's about. So I kind of want to hear you break down a little bit. Like, where are you landing on the overall theme of the movie, or like where did you find the crux of the story to be?
Well, my struggle with this film, and maybe this is time for Brad's nitpicks, but the struggle for me in this film was the fact that if you were honest with yourself and you took just the plot of Murrow v. McCarthy, that probably fills up like 45, 50 minutes of this movie. And the rest of it, you just get a lot of weird little ancillary things, like Robert Downey Jr. being married and them like trying to hide their relationship, and Jeff Daniels telling them that he has to let one of them go, and they get to choose who it is. And it just feels like there's enough other things in there, even like the whole Hollenbeck, this rivalry that he has with a newspaper writer. It all just feels like Clooney was really trying his best to turn a 50-minute movie, like documentary almost, into a feature-length film. And so for me, that's where the slowness of the movie took a toll on me and caused me to struggle with maintaining interest. Whereas like the Murrow versus McCarthy stuff, I thought was spot on. It's done stunningly well.
See, this is getting me back to something that I've brought up a couple times on the show, which is that idea of like the story versus plot, diagram, and how the plot should really like go down as the movie keeps going on, and the story should really emerge, like what it's actually about. And I think the plot of this movie is McCarthy versus Murrow, or Murrow versus McCarthy. But the story of the movie, and I kind of talked about this a little bit in the first half, though, is what is the cost of doing the right thing? And I think that you're right that on its face, I think that the Robert Downey Jr., Patricia Clarkson marriage subplot it's less compelling, right? Because you don't have a senator coming after them. But then when you start to think about it, like they do have a senator coming after them. And I think I'm really glad that Murrow kind of stays in the newsroom. We don't like go home with him at the end of the day and see what his life is like. We're watching Murrow's decisions having an impact on the people who have boots on the ground. Like just your average cameraman and whatever his wife does, typographist or whatever she does. Like you see it weighing on Murrow that he knows his actions are going to affect not just him, but everybody in that newsroom. And then I think for Clooney to give us those two characters, the reason they're in the movie is for us to be able to identify with, right? Like we're not Edward R. Murrow, but we could be Robert Downey Jr. and Patricia Clarkson. And I think to have them there and to see the way that they're constantly in fear of being found out as well really kind of humanizes the conflict that's at the heart of the movie. So I continue to see this movie as like, this is a movie about the cost of doing the right thing, standing up for your morals. You might lose your job, and there isn't necessarily like a happy smile of an ending. Like in the history books, we see, yeah, they took down McCarthy, and I'm really glad that, that hasn't happened again, quote unquote, in America. But you don't necessarily see the cost to the people who did the work behind the scenes. And so I actually really like seeing that. And again, that's one of those things that I think is more rewarding on the rewatch. But for your first time, yeah, I totally understand why that seems less compelling.
But it doesn't even really convey the message of the cost, because what happens after they are quote unquote found out as a married couple? One of them gets laid off. And show me a moment when that happens where either of them is disappointed.
Right, but I think the implication
both of them are just pumped that people knew that they were married. They're just like, oh yeah,
but it's one of those scenes where you have to read between the lines, though, because the reason that they're laying people off is because CBS has lost all of its sponsors because of what Murrow did. And so the whole reason that one of them basically outs themselves, as a married person breaking this company policy, it was really like Jeff Daniels extending an olive branch and being like, hey, it's either one of you guys because you're already in violation of the rules, or we lay off one of your friends who haven't done anything wrong. And I think that it might not seem, again, like it on the surface, but it absolutely is related to what Murrow was doing.
Yeah, I obviously picked up the fact that it's Murrow's doing that people are getting laid off.
No, I know. I'm not trying to say you didn't pick up on that. I'm just,
Yeah. I just feel like that subplot never really worked. And if it was really supposed to hammer home like people are being impacted like this, then maybe don't have them all smiling and happy about the fact that people know they're married.
Right.
I don't know. I think the other thing for me is that the cinematography for this movie at certain moments is really well done, but I texted you in the middle of this. Clooney, I don't know if he knows how to use a mid-range or long-range shot. 97% of this movie is shot in blackhead frame, where it's so close up on people's faces that you could pick up every single little, facial defect that they might have.
Right.
And that for me was a struggle. The close cam was used over and over and over again. And I get it. A great close cam can really heighten the tension of a scene. I think I was watching Cinema Therapy the other day, and they said that the best special effects you can ever have in a movie is a good actor's face. Like, that's all you need. And I'm with them. I agree with that. I just think Clooney went a little bit overboard in this movie with the close-up on people's faces as they're talking seriously about things around them.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I do think that, if you got your wish, though, and there were more, two shots in this movie, and they were farther away from people's faces, that you would be even more bored by what was happening. I think that any tension that this movie actually has comes from it feeling claustrophobic. So, yeah, again, I'm in a slightly different place than you. I feel like it's going to sound like we disagree on this movie more than we actually do, Brad. And it's time for us to move into final scores here. I hope I've convinced somebody to go watch this movie, because I think this movie is freaking fantastic. I think every directorial decision Clooney made is the right one. I think the script is near perfect. It's one of those movies that I always recommend, watch it with the subtitles on, because you'll get so much more out of it. I'm giving this one a 10 out of 10, Brad.
I think that it's fun to think about movie universes outside of the Marvel Cinematic Universe or Lord of the Rings or whatever else have you. There's a World War II movie universe out there where you could just compile all the different World War II movies and think about them in conjunction with one another. Now, for me, I'm sure there's other movies about news people out there, but for me now, you have Network and you have Good Night and Good Luck. And honestly, Bob, I mentioned this to you earlier in text. Good Night and Good Luck and Network should be required viewing for every high school senior. In my mind, these two movies highlight the reality that a lot of the things we think are true, a lot of the things that are presented to us through the media that we feel like are accurate, have a viewpoint, have an ideology firing on all cylinders behind them. That there's big money trying to get us to believe certain ideas Now, in the end, I don't want to become so deconstructionistic that you get rid of all systems, that I'm not an anarchist here saying get rid of all news, get rid of all, media outlets. I think what I am saying is I just wish people had a better ability to formulate their own viewpoints, an ability to look at the facts that are presented to them and make decisions for themselves. And part of that onus, I think, is on the news outlets. It's on the media to be more honest in their reporting. But I think it's also on the private citizen, too, to really filter everything they hear, whether it's from the news outlets they love, that have the viewpoints they like, or the news outlets they don't like, to give it an honest shot, to be open to what they're saying. So I think that the message that you have here that is promoted by Murrow, the alternating viewpoints that are given by Paley and Jeff Daniels' character, I think the movie just does a fantastic job of representing that worldview. For me, it's just a few things in the plot, the story, the cinematography that keep me from really giving this, a 10 out of 10. But for me, this movie is a 9 out of 10. I think it should be required viewing for everybody out there. So go watch it. It's spectacular. It is a little bit slow, but you're only in for an hour and a half. So go check it out.
All right, Brad, that means that it is time for us to spin the wheel of destiny here to pick our next movie. We've got the remainder of your movies here in this randomized wheel list. I'm going to click spin on this wheel. I need you to make some nice clickety-clack noises for me. What's that?
It was just a clicking noise.
Shug-a-duck.
That's it, man.
Oh, my gosh. All right, we are going to be watching the 1955 Alfred Hitchcock-directed, Cary Grant starring To Catch a Thief. Brad, I'm excited for that one. Always up for some Hitchcock on this podcast.
Yeah, dude, I just think that To Catch a Thief is one of the early Cary Grant films that helped me fall in love with Cary Grant. So that's why it's on the list, and I am excited to talk about it with you.
All right, we'll be back next Monday to watch that one. If you'd like to reach out to us about this week's episode, you can find us on all of our social medias, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, @FilmWhiskey.
Or join the conversation yourself. Over on our Discord channel, we talk all things movies, whiskey, trucking, New Orleans. I mean, we just get into everything over there. So if you want to have more of a personal connection with us, get on our Discord. You can find the link to it at the end of every single show notes.
All right, we'll be back next Monday. Until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.